On the 26th of July, 1794, Maximilien Robespierre, perhaps the most public face of what would come to be known as the Reign of Terror, and a revolution that would completely change the face of a nation and alter the course of human history, had been turned on by his associates. The man who'd been hailed as a hero just a few months previous was now reportedly foaming at the mouth, positively choking with rage, as his emboldened peers now felt confidence enough to openly accuse him before the crowd. "The blood of Danton chokes him," someone is said to have shouted, referencing the recent guillotining of his former friend and associate. Finally finding his voice, he utters the one statement accorded to him. "Is it Danton you regret? Cowards, then why didn't you defend him?" At 2 a.m., as soldiers stormed the Hôtel de Ville, he's said to have leapt from a ledge in attempts to escape, landing on a civilian and a pile of bayonets, reportedly fracturing his pelvis in the process. His associate, Lebas, proceeds to hand him a pistol before killing himself. Robespierre fails in the act, shooting himself, but only fracturing his jaw in the process. He is detained, and on the evening of the 28th is led to the scaffold. He's said to have kept his eyes shut throughout. Yet, as he mounted the stairs to meet his final moments, his executioner, as a final insult, ripped the bandage from his face, producing a piercing and agonizing scream, only to be silenced by the final death blow. It's often said that revolutions eat their children, and Robespierre, along with so many of his peers, would come to epitomize this. The man who for so many became the central figurehead of the French Revolution, labeled the incorruptible by his throngs of enthusiastic supporters, now slumped lifeless, headless, on a warm Paris evening, as these same crowds cheered. So if Robespierre was the public face of the revolution, that type of true believer that every conspiratorial movement requires to convince the public that genuine feeling and earnest beliefs were the central driving force behind it all, who represented the private face. Nearly a decade before Robespierre's death, on the night of July 10th, 1785, almost as if by divine providence, a lightning bolt from the heavens would strike and kill one Jacob Lang, a supposed priest by profession. Bavarian authorities immediately scrambled to the scene, leaving the man with him at the time, one Adam Weishaupt, no time to remove the secret documents sewn into the clothing of his fallen associate. What was discovered that night by the police would cause panic across the royal houses of much of Europe, and a string of raids and confiscation of hundreds of similar documents in the homes of their comrades and compatriots. Discovered within these documents was nothing less than the detailed plans of a revolution, intended to dispense with monarchies, the aristocracy, and the church across all of the powers of Europe, and to replace these with new power structures under the control of what, until this lightning strike, had very much been a secret society, one with incredibly efficient reach and with agents that represented some of the most powerful, influential, competent, and highly placed men in all of Europe, painstakingly recruited for these very reasons. The name of this organization has since become a cliché, being used and misused countless times by scores of amateur investigators, often to the point of mockery. But the Illuminatus organization, led by this Adam Weishaupt, more commonly known as the Illuminati, was the furthest thing from a joke in the late 1700s, to the extent that the Duke Karl Theodor of Bavaria issued an edict banning all secret societies, and mentioned this specific organization by name. In a revolution absolutely dominated by the machinations of secret societies, The three that seemed to play the leading roles were undoubtedly the Jesuits, the Masons, and the Illuminati. And if we're to believe the correspondence between its members, or the surviving accounts written by men with relevant knowledge of the day, it seems the latter may have largely infiltrated and puppeted the former, and acted as the key instigating and orchestrating force behind the scenes. Supposedly dissolved as a result of the Bavarian government's efforts, it was widely suspected that this disbanding was merely superficial and for public consumption. And again, the private letters between its members seem to clearly back this up. For this reason, and so many others, in the late 1700s, it was as if a dark cloud had descended over France, one long in the making, quietly coalescing and building up its energy in preparation to unleash a storm. This energy, as is always the case in major movements, represented a mixture of the true believers, those who felt real grievances and believed this was their path to alleviate them, and those that might perhaps be called the true movers behind the scenes, those who masterfully played upon these grievances, and who then portrayed what seemed to be, in actuality, a painstakingly well-planned and shrewdly orchestrated overthrow of the monarchy and aristocracy as some spontaneous and organic outburst of public anger. But this darkness seemed above and beyond the merely political or ideological. It seemed also to have a spiritual dimension, and certainly not in the positive sense of the word. After all, this spiritual dimension has a yin and yang, a light side and a dark side. And in this handful of years, France seemed to be gripped, profoundly possessed even, by this dark side. To their monarchist opponent, the revolutionaries would become like children who, in a fit of blind rage, had brutally killed their father, and then frenetically glance around the room with wild eyes in search of their next target. Primal energies seemed at play here, and these deaths, so often, weren't the quick guillotine or bullet to the head, but rather the men responsible frequently seemed to relish the wanton cruelty on the deepest levels, and the mobs looking on were said to have often become equally excited by what would soon degenerate into wholly unrestrained violence. Eustace Mullins openly called it demonic, and this point would be hard to argue against. A dark energy was unleashed in these years. It was as if an entire people had been convinced to throw long-standing principles and fundamental human decency to the wind in exchange for a cathartic orgy of blood. As if those more disoriented and degenerate elements of society, normally kept in check by a timeless conception of law and order, natural hierarchy, and a vigilant populace, wasn't just let loose on the world, but positively pushed to its forefront, handed the most efficient tools, and given free license, even encouragement. But before we dive exclusively into the revolution itself, it's important to set the stage. No event this consequential spontaneously materializes out of thin air. The roots and the invaluable context may be oft ignored, even at times hidden or purposefully obscured, but there's always a backstory and a stepwise progression. And in this case, the backstory is as murky as it is crucial and all-important. There's a little-known quote from a young Winston Churchill in which he speaks of major revolutions across the world and the commonalities between them. Amidst a string of conspiratorial revolutions, the very first revolutionary name cited is Spartacus Weishaupt. His reference here is, of course, to Adam Weishaupt, to one of the most covertly influential men to ever walk the face of the earth, by any objective standard. Churchill uses the name Spartacus here because all members of this organization would take on a pseudonym of a historical personage as a mask. and Adam had chosen Spartacus. But even here, we're required to go back still further. No organization of this caliber simply springs, fully formed and with seemingly infinite funds and the most powerful connections, out of nowhere. Its roots stretch far deeper. As the power of the Visigoths collapsed, a great animosity was developing between Jews and Christians throughout the region which we today call Spain, largely centered upon the crucial city of Toledo, culminating in Muslim invasions in which the local Jewish population often worked with the invaders, at times providing intelligence on where or when to strike, or material support, or, in some reported instances, even literally opening the gates from the inside when Muslim armies arrived to conquer. After these invasions, the cooperative Jews were often granted the highest governmental positions by the victorious Muslim armies, as they turned their attentions elsewhere to repeat this cycle. Many Christians never forgot this, and fiercely anti-Jewish sentiment in southwestern Europe frequently flared up as a result. Among the attempts to control the situation were laws and regulations passed against the Jewish people, edicts of expulsion, even forced mass conversions. And it was these forced conversions that would leave the most lasting historical imprint. Instead of parting with their wealth, and perhaps what they considered their own homeland, a great many Jews decided to convert to Christianity. But, crucially, a large subset of these conversions were only superficial. Talmudic doctrine even openly allowed for this, if and when these conversions helped attain valuable utilitarian aims. Those who took this path came to be known as conversos, or Marranos, and though on the surface they seemed to blend into the scenery of the Christian church of the day, a great many had no belief in Christ or Christian doctrine, and in fact felt a burning resentment toward the population that had all but forcibly compelled them down this path. Cecil Roth tells us, quote, "In fact, the classical land of crypto-Jewry is Spain. Tradition there has been durable and universal to such an extent that one must raise the suspicion that a Marranian receptivity is present in the atmosphere of the land itself." End quote. One of the effects of this cause was the sudden emergence of several new, quote, Christian doctrines. One of these was called the Alumbrados, a Marrano-created faction considered heretical by the Church. Ignatius Loyola, who would later go on to found the Jesuits, was himself almost certainly a Marrano Alumbrado, according to surviving accounts. And this was a leading charge against him during the Inquisition, a fact mysteriously left out of the leading biographical account of the man, written by another converso by the name of Pedro de Ribadeneira. In his work, The Jesuit Order as a Synagogue of Jews, Robert Merriggs tells a fascinating tale about the earliest days of the Jesuit order, and the, quote, purity of blood laws that would go on to create such deep divides in the order. A portion of Jesuits seemed to welcome conversos and Marranos with open arms. Others were openly hostile, or sought to keep them at arm's length. Initially, this latter group largely won out, or at least exercised real influence. But over time, it was the former that would come to dominate. Adam Spartacus Weishaupt was, in turn, a trained Jesuit. This Jesuit connection was one he apparently kept fairly quiet, but it's fascinating to read the conversations between Weishaupt and Knigge, the man who was essentially his right-hand man and number two for a significant period of time, and who finally declared openly in this correspondence his suspicions that Adam was a, quote, Jesuit in disguise. Many argue, fairly convincingly, that the, quote, Illuminati was not Weishaupt's creation, but rather a continuation or direct outgrowth of an older order, or an openly secular and humanist fresh new iteration of this brutally efficient, power-seeking order. John Robeson tells us, quote, "I have observed these doctrines gradually diffusing and mixing with all of the different systems of Freemasonry, till, at last, an association has been formed for the express purpose of rooting out all the religious establishments and overturning all the existing governments of Europe. I have seen this association exerting itself zealously and systematically till it has become almost irresistible. And I have seen that the most active leaders in the French Revolution were members of this association and conducted their first movements according to its principles." End quote. The Comte de Verrou, upon his return to Paris after attending a meeting as a delegate representing the Masonic Lodge and Wilhelmsbad, stated, "I shall not tell you the secrets which I have brought back, but what I believe I may tell you is that a plot is being hatched, so well contrived and so deep that it will be difficult for religion and for the government not to succumb." End quote. The Illuminati was a wholly unique organization, built along the lines of an elaborate utilitarian spy network, in which each isolated cell of initiates reported to a superior whom they did not know. Brutally efficient, focused, and single-minded, according to all correspondence, their goal seemed to be a decimation of the existing order, to be replaced with one of their own design. The great Edmund Burke puts it best, quote, "The abolition of monarchy by divine right was the condition sine qua non of the entire scheme. It was impossible to attempt anything against society under this form of government. The revolution, which, we are told, was made for the people, was in reality made against the people. The monarchy and aristocracy were not destroyed because they were oppressing France, but because, on the contrary, they protected it too well." In the eyes of aristocrats, conservatives, and royalists, the degradation of Western nations and their governments was viewed as caused by a series of wolves in sheep's clothing, clever sophists and lawyerly wordsmiths, packaging the most dangerous and detrimental philosophies and ideas in the most pleasant and inoffensive garb, to most efficiently harness a critical mass of public energy and enthusiasm, and subsequently orient this energy toward the destruction of their own nation's traditional power structures. That said, many of the grievances honed in on and further stoked by these revolutionists did have merit from a certain perspective. By today's democratic standards, the French public was definitely lacking in direct representative power. Regardless of how justly or unjustly this power was wielded, it's a simple fact that in the French governmental structure, called the Estates General, there were three factions with equal influence: the clergy as the first estate, the nobility as the second, and the commons as the third. And that because the vast majority of the population was in this third group, a handful of men that comprised the first two groups exercised immensely disproportionate influence as a result. Though the combined first and second estates represented approximately 2% of the population, on issues in which they sided with one another, they were able to outvote this third estate, despite it representing nearly 98% of the population. In a nation in which the nobles and aristocrats are celebrated as the crowning glory of a people, this had posed no serious issue or problem. But as the nation gradually morphed into one in which personal power and, quote, rights became something of an obsession, with the help of lawyerly wordsmiths like the Jacobins assuring the population that they were being mistreated and abused, this framework quickly came to be seen as a means of oppression. By 1789, the Third Estate had begun to agitate for greater powers and influence, to the extent that it began to violate conventions and attempt to set new precedent. This caused King Louis to step in, and in June of that year, he would literally shut the doors in an attempt to prevent their holding formal, officially sanctioned meetings. The Third Estate responded by simply meeting outside Versailles, famously taking what's become known as the tennis court oath, swearing not to disperse until a new constitution was formed. Soon, they were joined by a majority of the First Estate, and 47 of the 291 members of the Second Estate, marking an immediate and massive shift in power. From this point forward, they called themselves the National Assembly and saw themselves as the new, true center of power. This was something of a crossing the Rubicon moment, and with their fears inflamed by some of the most skillfully manipulative propagandists, from this point forward, all involved would feel a constant paranoia about how the king and crown might react, continually believing a brutal crackdown might come at any moment, causing them to move ever more quickly and forcefully as a result. This led to the infamous storming of the Bastille, a symbol of the ancient regime, and a testament to the increasing divergence between the propaganda picture and the reality of the situation. Though this was celebrated as a major victory and decisive blow, we now know the prison held just 7 men, most of whom were mere forgers and petty criminals. And, in a testament to the horrors soon to come, the governor, whose only offense seemed to be performing his sworn duty in the guarding of the Bastille, would end up with his head on the end of a pike, being paraded around the city by a mob. After much editing and reworking, including inputs by Thomas Jefferson himself, a new constitution was submitted on the 26th of August, 1789. A, quote, Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. It proved to be a radical departure from tradition and convention in the Western world, and a full-scale assault on hierarchy and aristocracy. And it would produce something of a stalemate, with the crown and nobles unwilling to agree with the extreme changes, yet at the same time not wanting to use force against their own people to quell this revolutionary sentiment, with many even being sympathetic to several of their leading arguments. As debates raged, the financial crisis worsened, and food shortages became ever more dire, creating a powder keg, just waiting for a spark. On the 1st of October, the officers at Versailles held their customary welcoming banquet for the officers of the newly arrived troops, which the royal family also customarily attended. It's said that as the night went on and as the alcohol flowed, the soldiers' toasts and oaths of fealty to the king grew more unrestrained and demonstrative. The gossip and propaganda publications of the day, especially Jean-Paul Marat's The Friend of the People, greatly exaggerated, and in some cases outright invented, stories of what occurred that night, including claims that these officers of the noble class had openly trampled upon the tricolored cockade and professed their allegiance solely to the white cockade of the House of Bourbon. These inflammatory rumors, coupled with food shortages, runaway inflation, and aggressive price gouging, led to one of the first major pivotal events of these years, and what would come to be known as the Women's March on Versailles, in what seems to have been a microcosm of the revolution as a whole. What began as a group of sincere marchers with legitimate grievances gradually snowballed into an angry mob, directed and goaded on by the agents and representatives of hidden hands. The crowd marched for 6 hours from Paris to Versailles, directly to the king, whom they decided to remove from his royal residence and forcibly relocate to Paris. With their anger artfully stoked to a fever pitch, they now seem to be on the brink of extreme violence. Edmund Burke gives this account, quote, History will record that on the morning of the 6th of October, 1789, the King and Queen of France, after a day of confusion, alarm, dismay, and slaughter, lay down under the pledged security of public faith to indulge nature in a few hours of respite and troubled, melancholy repose. From this sleep, the Queen was first startled by the voice of the sentinel at her door, who cried out to her to save herself by flight, that this was the last proof of fidelity he could give, that they were upon him, and he was dead. Instantly he was cut down. A band of cruel ruffians and assassins, reeking with his blood, rushed into the chamber of the queen, and pierced with 100 strokes of the bayonets and poniards the bed from whence this persecuted woman had but just time to fly, almost naked, and through ways unknown to the murderers, had escaped to seek refuge at the feet of a king and husband, not secure of his own life for a moment. This king, to say no more of him, and this queen, and their infant children, who once would have been the pride and hope of a great and generous people, were then forced to abandon the sanctuary of the most splendid palace in the world, which they left swimming in blood, polluted by massacre, and strewn with scattered limbs and mutilated carcasses. Thence they were conducted into the capital of their kingdom. 2 had been selected from the unprovoked, unresisted, promiscuous slaughter, which was made of the gentlemen of birth and family who composed the king's bodyguard. These 2 gentlemen, with all the parade of an execution of justice, were cruelly and publicly put to the block and beheaded in the great court of the palace. Their heads were stuck upon spears and led the procession, whilst the royal captives who followed in the train were slowly moved along amidst the horrid yells and shrilling screams and frantic dances and infamous contumelies and all the unutterable abominations of the furies of hell in the abused shape of the vilest of women. After they had been made to taste, drop by drop, more than the bitterness of death and the slow torture of a journey of 12 miles, protracted to 6 hours, they were, under a guard, composed of those very soldiers who had thus conducted them through this famous triumph, lodged in one of the old palaces of Paris, now converted into a Bastille for kings." End quote. It's said the crowd escorting the royal family to Paris was 60,000 strong, as they were escorted into their new residence on the Seine River, said to be dark and uncomfortable, and no doubt foreboding. It was clear to all that power had now shifted. Perhaps no one understood this so well as the king himself. After arriving at the dilapidated Tuileries Palace, abandoned since the reign of Louis XIV, he was asked for his orders, and he replied with an uncharacteristic diffidence. "Let everyone put himself where he pleases," he said. Then, in an action that spoke volumes, he said to have requested that a history of the deposed Charles I of England be brought to him from his library. King Louis XVI of France, now essentially held under house arrest in the Tuileries Palace, intuitively sensed the unprecedented amount of tension and danger in the air, and was encouraged by family and trusted men to take refuge with a highly respected loyalist general, François Bouillet. But in June 1792, an armed crowd once again stormed the royal abode, condemning the king as Monsieur Veto due to his hesitance to fully embrace the destruction of France's traditional monarchical system and demanding he pass all of their desired decrees. A group carrying weapons and a small artillery piece gained access to the king's quarters, and one man, bearing an axe, directly approached the king. He managed to quell the invaders by listening to their demands and politely promising to consider them. It's said that he then donned the red liberty bonnet, that classic ancient Phrygian cap so misused and abused by the revolutionaries, and toasted the health of the nation. In another room, the queen and her children were also surrounded by a hostile mob. Marie Antoinette's 14-year-old daughter later described the incident. Quote, "We were obliged to stay there and listen to all of the insults that these wretches said to us as they passed. A half-clothed woman dared to come to the table with a bonnet rouge in her hand, and my mother was forced to let her place it on her son's head. As for us, we were obliged to put cockades on our heads." It was about 8 o'clock when this dreadful procession of rioters ceased to pass, and we were able to rejoin my father and aunt. End quote. Out of good options, the king, with royal family in tow, left the palace in disguise on the 20th of June, 1791, but was recognized as he passed through Varennes. Arrested and taken back to Paris, he was forced to swear an oath to the new regime. Because both Prussia and Austria supported the crown and the monarchy against the revolutionary element of the Third Estate, and because the people were being convinced by the Parisian press that the king was in talks with one or both of these powers, the prevailing belief that Louis sought to take refuge in Austria, a nation with whom they were now on the brink of war, served only to anger the public still further. Things were now reaching a boiling point. On July 17th of 1791, a radical by the name of Jacques-Pierre Brissot, a leading member of the Girondins and the founder of the, quote, Society of the Friends of Blacks, drew a large crowd in the Champ de Mars, demanding the deposition of the king. The National Guard, headed by the Marquis de Lafayette, who had thus far taken steps to win respect from both sides of the conflict, chose to respond to their barrage of stones with gunfire, killing approximately 20 people. Things were now at a full boil. By the early days of a sweltering August in Paris, the city was filled with rumors about the fate of the king. Some believed the Austrians and Prussians were about to stage a daring raid to rescue Louis and his family from the Tuileries. Others believed the king was plotting to flee to Rouen. The fact that foreign troops were in Paris was manipulatively latched onto by the more aggressive revolutionary propagandists to create and spread fear that King Louis was secretly planning to massacre them all. None of this was true, but in this extremely highly charged atmosphere, truth no longer had a significant role to play. Tactically, the Tuileries should have been easy to defend. It had strong fortifications. It was protected on one side by the Seine, and, unlike the Bastille, was heavily manned. But the gendarmes and the National Guard in the Tuileries were unreliable. Anticipating a massacre, most fled during the night of August 9th, leaving only the brave and stalwart Swiss Guard to defend the crown. Few dynamics better outline the nature of the French Revolution than the contrast between the Swiss Guard and the maddened mob that charged the royal palace under their protection. An elite fighting force and private guard to the king in the timeless tradition of Aryan cultures stretching back to the Varangian and Praetorian Guard and beyond. Their order to guard the palace was said to have been carried out without the slightest hesitation and without the slightest hint of complaint or objection. Evidence indicates that they understood this mission would likely be their last, including the secret burial of their regimental standard the day before this final stand, on the 9th and 10th of August, 1792. The violence was realized on August 10th. That day, leaders in Paris declared the city to be an independent commune and called for the abolition of the Bourbon monarchy. Led by sympathetic National Guardsmen, now utterly beyond Lafayette's control, a crowd descended on the Tuileries Palace. Recognizing the immense danger, the king and his family barricaded themselves in their chambers. However, neither locked doors nor the presence of the Swiss Guard could deter an infuriated mob determined, quote, to attack the palace, exterminate everybody, and force the king to abdicate, end quote. The crowd, numbering in the tens of thousands, approached the palace, insisting that the king be brought before the National Assembly. After surveying the situation, the king concluded that it was impossible to defend the palace without slaughtering thousands of Parisians. Early on in the morning of the 10th of August, after leaving orders with the guard, and what these exact orders were is disputed to this day, the king and his family, accompanied by the commander of the Swiss Guard, Karl Josef von Bachmann, and 150 members of his guard, fled to the National Assembly. That morning, the 750 or so remaining guards, under the command of the Lucerne officer Jost Derler, continued to defend the palace as discipline decreed. The mob, almost all armed with the widest variety of weapons, had now swelled to tens of thousands, so densely packed that it said 25 people were killed simply by the crush of the crowd. For the royals, especially the children, the sights and sounds must have been terrifying. Surrounded by the intruders, the Swiss Guard, either having not received the king's message, allowing them to lay down their arms, or simply refusing to be cowed at such a crucial moment, and with the royal family in such grave danger, continued to fight. What followed was a scene of tremendous butchery. More than 2/3 of the Swiss Guard were slaughtered, many of them hacked to death by axe-wielding sans-culottes. Heads were removed and displayed on pikes or kicked around for sport. Body parts were dismembered and waved around, then fed to dogs. Hordes of women from the city's underclass followed behind the advancing soldiers, stripping the corpses of the Swiss guardmen of their uniforms and belongings, scything off their genitals and stuffing them into their mouths. A young Napoleon, who was an eyewitness to the storming, later told his brother Joseph that the carnage that he saw that day affected him more profoundly than any of the subsequent killing fields he was to witness in his lifetime. Courtiers and palace staff were not spared either. By the end of the day, some 650 Swiss Guard were dead, while the remaining 250 were captured, beaten, and thrown into the city's prisons. These prisons, by early September of 1792, now filled to overflowing with the opponents of the new regime, represented a threat to the revolutionists. Jean-Paul Marat called for a, quote, new bloodletting, and argued for the mass murder of both those in prison and any ideological opponents they might round up on the streets. He's said to have suggested setting them on fire as the means of death, but they eventually settled on butchery, literally importing a group of the most violent and psychopathic criminals from Genoa and Sicily, who came to be known as Marseilles, to outsource the handling of the murders. They were paid $24 each for their services and would be promptly sent away from Paris when the deed was done. The goal, after all, was to make these deaths look like the result of popular uprising, not imported murder squads. This massacre was officially kicked off on September 2nd, around 1 p.m., with George Danton, widely considered, along with Robespierre and Jean-Paul Marat, as one of the foremost instigators of the revolution, delivered a speech in the assembly, stating, "We ask that anyone refusing to give personal service or to furnish arms shall be punished with death. The bell we are about to ring sounds the charge on the enemies of our country." The bloodshed began around 2:30 p.m. in the middle of the Saint-Germain-des-Prés, and within the first 20 hours, more than 1,000 prisoners were killed. The resulting brutality shocked visiting dignitaries, the vast majority of whom sought to quickly flee France as a consequence. And it wasn't just murder. The butchers then mutilated the bodies, with circumstances of barbarity too shocking to describe, according to the British diplomatic dispatch. It's said that people sat on the stairs of the Palace of Justice, watching the butchery in the courtyard. Not far away, French novelist Nicolas Breton reported seeing stacks of bodies piled high before being unceremoniously tossed into the river. No one was spared, not priests or women or children. For 5 days, the slaughter, the mutilation of corpses, the parading of heads and other body parts on pikes around the city continued. Only on the 6th of December did it finally begin to abate. Now that the defenders of the king and monarchy had been massacred, these lawyerly revolutionists turned their attention to the king himself, holding a show trial with, almost certainly, a predetermined outcome, in which they settled, perhaps not entirely by chance, on a total of 33 charges against him. The king sat quietly and listened to these 33 charges, sitting in the same armchair in which he had accepted the Constitution. The words of his defense counsel were likely stated more for the sake of your ears, that is to say, for historical posterity, than to any of the already decided parties in the room at that moment, and helped illustrate, for the record, the multitude of concessions the king had made in attempt to avoid this bloody path the nation was choosing. Quote, Louis ascended to the throne at the age of 20, and at the age of 20 he gave to the throne the example of character. He brought to the throne no wicked weaknesses, no corrupting passions. He was economical, just, severe. He showed himself always the constant friend of the people. The people wanted abolition of servitude. He began by abolishing it on his own lands. The people asked for reforms in the criminal law. He carried out these reforms. The people wanted liberty. He gave it to them. The people themselves came before him in his sacrifices. Nevertheless, it is in the name of these very people that one today demands, "Citizens, I cannot finish. I stop myself before history. Think how it will judge your judgment, and that the judgment of him will be judged by the centuries." End quote. And finally, King Louis XVI himself rose and spoke, quote, "You have heard my defense. I would not repeat the details. In talking to you, perhaps for the last time, I declare that my conscience reproaches me with nothing, and that my defenders have told you the truth. I never feared the public examination of my conduct, but my heart is torn by the imputation that I would want to shed the blood of the people, and especially that the misfortunes of August 10th be attributed to me. I avow that the many proofs that I have always acted from love of the people, and the manner in which I have always conducted myself, seemed to prove that I did not fear to put myself forward in order to spare their blood, and forever prevent such an imputation." End quote. The resulting vote, a foregone conclusion, was 380 to 286 in favor of immediate execution. And on the 21st of January, the King of France rose from bed, took confession, heard his final Mass, and took his final communion. And, purposefully avoiding a heart-wrenching final scene with his family, he boarded a carriage, flanked on either side by 2 militiamen, escorted by a large cavalry troop with drawn sabers, and preceded by a mass of drummers to drown out any potential support for the king. The hour-long journey to the Place de la Révolution was guarded over by 80,000 men spread out along the route. It's said the king refused to have his hands bound with rope, but finally consented to a handkerchief instead. They cut his hair, removed his collar, and walked him up the scaffold. Edgeworth, Louis's Irish confessor, wrote in his memoirs, "The path leading up to the scaffold was extremely rough and difficult to pass. The king was obliged to lean on my arm, and from the slowness with which he proceeded, I feared for a moment that his courage might fail. But what was my astonishment, when arrived at the last step, I felt that he suddenly let go of my arm, and I saw him cross with a firm foot the breadth of the whole scaffold. Silenced by his look alone, 15 or 20 drums that were placed opposite to me, and in a voice so loud that it must have been heard at the Pont Tournant, I heard him pronounce distinctly these memorable words: 'I die innocent of all the crimes laid to my charge. I pardon those who have occasioned my death, and I pray to God that the blood you are going to shed may never be visited on France.'" End quote. The blade fell. It was 10:22 a.m. A well-known legend states that as soon as the guillotine fell, an anonymous Freemason leapt onto the scaffolding, plunged his hands into the blood, splashed drips of it onto the crown, and shouted, "Jacques de Molay, thou art avenged." De Molay, who died in 1314, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, had reportedly cursed King Louis's ancestor, Philip the Fair, after the latter had sentenced him to be burned at the stake. This legend spread widely, and the phrase remains in use today to indicate the triumph of reason and logic over, quote, religious superstition. Though the discussion of the Knights Templar is beyond the scope here, at least a few words should be said. Philip IV's reign, which ended with his death in 1315, was marked by struggles both with Jews, whom he'd eventually expel in 1306, and the Knights Templar, whom he'd destroy in 1307. And he's said to have seen them as, quote, a state within a state, and one growing so wealthy that they'd threaten to fully eclipse the power of the crown. What had begun as a seemingly brave and noble order of Christian knights devoted to safeguarding traveling pilgrims seems to have slowly morphed into the world's first multinational corporation, and, by some accounts, a coven of conspiratorial bankers. Toward its end, it's said that over 90% of their membership was composed of non-combatants. In other words, no longer brave knights safeguarding Christians from Muslims and bandits, but mere bankers and financiers. Was this society, much like the Freemasons, infiltrated and co-opted to serve unspoken interests, used as a mechanism to bring nations and governments and kings under the heel of debt slavery, and thus into the service of bankers and moneymen and their interests? Princess Marie-Therese Lamballe, a close friend of Marie Antoinette, was one of the great many to be brutally cut down in the massacre of September 1792. Refusing to swear an oath of hatred toward the king and queen, she understood the cost of her loyalty. Quote, I have nothing more to say. It is indifferent to me if I die a little earlier or later. I have made the sacrifice of my life. End quote. It's said that when guards escorted her outside, and she caught sight of the slaughter and piles of corpses, she reportedly cried, "The horror," or "I am lost." Reportedly, she was first struck by a man with a pike on her head, which caused her hair to fall down upon her shoulders, revealing a letter from Marie Antoinette, which she had hidden away. She was then wounded on the forehead, which caused her to bleed, after which she was stabbed to death by the maddened and frenzied crowd. Many accounts suggest her body was then abused and mutilated in creatively sadistic ways after her death, and her head was then paraded on a pike outside Marie Antoinette's window. Whether Danton or Jean-Paul Marat was most responsible for the September prison massacres is still debated, but both men, and even Robespierre, would attempt to paint this as a spontaneous outburst of public sentiment. And both, undoubtedly, played prominent roles in its instigation. Even the Girondin friend to the revolution, Brissot, wrote in The French Patriot, his newspaper, quote, "No doubt you will be told that it is a vengeance of the people. It will be a slander. The people were not involved in this event." End quote. And indeed, this event would mark the beginning of a split between the more moderate Girondin element, sometimes called Brissotins, and the more bloodthirsty and radical Jacobins and Montagnards, exemplified by Jean-Paul Marat, a split compared by some scholars to the divide between Mensheviks and Bolsheviks in later revolutionary Russia. And this split would have the most serious ramifications. Brissot fit the mold of another true believer, seemingly genuine and sincere, like Robespierre, though perhaps even more firmly attached to his principles. And he was now being flippantly dispensed with by extremists that no longer seemed interested in principles. Everywhere, things seemed to have degenerated into a mad, undisguised dash for power. Everywhere, the Girondins were pushed from power. Everywhere, the Jacobins and Montagnards rose to prominence. The kangaroo court trial of Brissot, who by all accounts made an impressive defense of himself and his cause, and embarrassed his opponents and their false charges, would end, like so many others, in his being guillotined, along with 28 compatriots, though it's said that they apparently sang happily on their way to their demise, and had embraced their role as martyrs, confident in the rightness of their actions. The Jacobins seemed to perfectly epitomize the class of individuals who so often open the door to revolution, the self-professed intellectuals and philosophers who so studiously and efficiently cultivated and propagated the ideological soil from which the brutal revolutionary violence was to grow. Their clubs and meeting organizations might best be understood as similar to the Freemasons, yet without the mask or subterfuge. In a sense, they became the public proactive arm of these secretive societies. Within just a few short years, Jacobin discussion and debate clubs were suddenly everywhere in Paris and throughout much of France, and their collective efforts were to have the most profound impact on the source of the revolution. The Jews of France, who'd been on the brink of expulsion at the outbreak of the revolution, saw their position vastly improved overnight, in large part due to these decidedly pro-Jewish Jacobins, and especially the Masonic element within them, who not only supported the mass-scale de-Christianization campaign throughout France, but were the foremost party responsible for pushing through legislation to give full rights to the Jews. Despite being voted down an incredible 13 times, they're said to have vowed to continue taking votes until it passed. And thus, on the 14th vote, it did. The Jacobins had become the new power, and the interests they served had become the new power center, not just in Paris, but all of France. Though chaos reigned, what seemed to be their real objective, the complete overthrow of the traditional order, had been accomplished. Lawyers, yellow journalists, and third-rate philosophers had harnessed and channeled public discontent to destroy not just a king, but to completely disempower or destroy the entire aristocracy. And it wasn't just their flesh and blood opponents these men labored to destroy. As is always the case with men at war with nature, in their desire to recreate reality from the ground up, they were also at war with history. Massive libraries were put to the torch. It's estimated that more than 4 million volumes were lost in total, quote, tossed like garbage into piles in city squares and burned while the mob cheered, end quote, including some of the most important works of medieval Europe. As historian Thomas Lecaque states, quote, the French Revolution represents at once a fundamental shift towards modernity and an irrevocable loss of medieval materiality. Mobs burst into the monastery, cathedral, parish church, castle, or palace, dragged the manuscripts out of the armoires where they had been stored for centuries, piled them in a mound in a public place, and lit the patrimony of the nation on fire. From the ashes, modernity arose, but at a cost, end quote. This revolution was intended to be a complete reset,